So having already looked at tanks from most of the major players of World War I, we now come to Russia, which while not having many domestic designs during World War I, was successful at using, modifying and reverse engineering British and French tanks that were captured during the subsequent Russian Civil War, in many cases making them far superior to the initial models on which they were based on. Of course, during World War I, while a need for armoured vehicles capable of crossing trenches and bringing heavy firepower to the enemy was quickly realised on the Western Front, this wasn't such a big issue on the Eastern Front, where on the vast expanses of the Eastern Front, trench warfare was much less common and mobile warfare was far more common, which along with tanks being slow and mechanically unreliable, resulted in far different requirements for tanks compared to the other nations on the Western Front. Coupled with the fact that nobody had actually created a tank before, many nations took inspiration from different areas. For example, German and French tanks took much inspiration from American Holt tractors. Russia, on the other hand, when developing their first tank, the Tsar tank, seems to have taken more inspiration from a penny farthing bicycle, with the design having two massive wheels at the front of the tank and one small wheel at the rear of the tank for steering, somewhat similar to the later American wheeled steam tank design. Suffice to say, the tank is pretty tall at 9 metres, compared to 3.3 metres for the German A7V or 2.1 metres for the French Renault FT17 light tank. So the Tsar tank would have towered over the battlefield, providing a good arc of fire for its various weapons, which would have been fitted in the main crew compartment and in 2 turrets, one of these underhanging the crew compartment and one mounted above the crew compartment. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to find what the intended weapons were, or if they were even fitted to the tank, though I suspect some larger cannons would have been installed, with the remainder of the armament made up by machine guns. The 2 large wheels were powered by 2 240 horsepower Maybach engines, which were salvaged from a German airship, each powering 1 wheel and giving a combined power of 480 horsepower. This is a large amount of horsepower available for the design, bearing in mind this design was from the 1914-1915 period, compared to the Mark 8 heavy tank from the end of the war, which had an engine with about 300 horsepower available, though that tank weighed just under 40 tonnes, while the Tsar tank weighs in at around 60 tonnes. As such, the Tsar tank was said to be capable of a top speed of 10.5 miles per hour or 17 kilometers an hour, almost double the top speed of the late war Mark 8 heavy tank, and a factor that would have been desirable for use on the Eastern Front, where large distances would need to be covered compared to the Western Front. As for the crew, I've seen a figure of 10 given, but unfortunately I've not been able to find any primary sources to confirm that figure. So given that the Tsar tank was built, what happened to it? Well, like I say, it was built and it was sent out on trials, with these tests initially starting out well, but eventually the small rear wheel got stuck in soft mud and it was unable to be freed, even with the 2 powerful engines driving the vehicle. After subsequent attempts to free the Tsar tank failed, it was abandoned, being forgotten for the rest of the war and the following Civil War, before eventually being scrapped in 1923. In War Thunder, I think the Tsar tank would be an extremely interesting tank, and would be a major selling point for Russian World War I tanks. However, I'm unsure at what battle rating it could be added because information on the armament is somewhat lacking, though I suspect a battle rating of 0.0 to 0.3 would be a good place for it, and it would be cool to see this vehicle added to War Thunder. Unfortunately, this was about as far as Russian domestic tank development got in World War I, so no domestically produced tanks were used during that conflict. There was another vehicle, the Vizitkhod, I've probably butchered that pronunciation, which is sometimes claimed as a tank design, but the word does also translate as all-terrain vehicle, and I have seen other sources saying that it was just designed as an all-terrain vehicle, and regardless, it was never armed, so I won't be covering it here. So, having failed to develop a domestic tank program during World War I, it is easy to imagine that there are no more Russian tanks to be added. But Russia did produce, use and modify World War I tanks from other nations, these being from France and Britain. And the reason these were in Russia was not due to World War I, but due to the subsequent Russian Revolution and Russian Civil War, with Russia's former allies intervening in the conflict, sending troops to various parts of Russia and supplying weapons to the anti-Bolshevik White Russian forces, who, as you can imagine, were fighting against the Red Bolshevik forces. I've probably oversimplified that a little bit, but that's the basic gist of it. One of the tanks supplied to the White Russian forces was the British Mark V heavy tank, which we have covered in a previous episode on British tanks, and essentially this was a slow-moving tank, only capable of a maximum speed of 4.6 miles per hour or 7.4 kilometers an hour, and was powered by a 150 horsepower petrol engine, with the tank protected by 12mm of armour and manned by a crew of 8. When it comes to the armament, this depends on the variant, with male variants being armed with two 57mm 6-pounder guns in 2 mounted sponsons on each side of the tank, as well as 4 7.7mm Hotchkiss machine guns, while female variants only had 6 7.7mm Hotchkiss machine guns, which could still be a threat to other tanks when firing AP bullets. However, it seems in Russia some of the tanks were delivered as or converted to hermaphrodites, or composite tanks, which had one sponson with a 57mm gun from a male tank and one sponson with machine guns from a female tank, giving a mix of hard-hitting and fast-firing weapons. Most of these Mark Vs were eventually captured by the Red Army, who would go on to use them during the invasion of Georgia, before scrapping or converting the survivors to memorials. Indeed, the vast majority of Mark Vs still in existence still reside within Russia or former Russian countries, with 2 of these even being captured by the Germans during World War II and taken to Berlin, where they were again recaptured by the Red Army at the end of the war. In-game, the female variants would have to be 0.0 vehicles, while the composite and male variants could go at 0.3, being reasonably well protected for the era and packing a punch with their hard-hitting armament, only really hamstrung by their slow speeds, but still excelling at crossing rough terrain. The other British tank given to White Russian forces was the medium Mark A, otherwise more commonly known as the Whippet tank, and this was a British tank armed with 4 7.7mm Hotchkiss machine guns in a fighting compartment at the rear of the vehicle, and this was protected by a maximum of 12mm of armour, manned by a crew of 3, and was capable of a top speed of 8.3 miles per hour or 13.3 kilometers an hour, so much faster than the Mark V. Again, these tanks were captured by the Red Army, and it seems at least one of them was converted to carry a 37mm Puteaux gun from the French Renault FT17 in place of the front-mounted machine gun. The gun is pretty bad in game, with a maximum penetration of 33mm at 100 metres, while using an APCR round which wasn't around during World War I, so the actual round used would be even worse, but it should still do better than the machine gun, of which 3 are still carried within the vehicle. The machine gun variant should be added at 0.0, while the 37mm armed variant could possibly go at 0.3, as it is now better suited to anti-tank work while mounted to a mobile chassis, though the small crew complement and the gun being mounted in a forward-facing casemate does somewhat limit its potential. France also sent their own tanks, in this case the Renault FT17 light tank, which represented a far more modern design than the British tanks, being smaller, more mobile, light enough to be transported by trucks, which helped to reduce mechanical wear, was fitted with a rotating turret and only required 2 men to crew the tank. Nonetheless, some of these FT-17s were captured, with many of these seeing combat in Red Army service. Nonetheless, the Soviets decided to reverse engineer the FT-17 in order to produce a copy of it, so that they could gain experience in designing and producing tanks. This new tank, which it seems to have just been named the Russian Renault or Ruski Renault, is very similar to the FT-17, but does have some differences. For example, it has the same top speed of 4.8 miles per hour or 7.5 kilometers an hour, but due to the new 34 horsepower petrol engine being physically bigger than the old 35 horsepower engine, the rear of the tank had to be widened. The main armament was also changed, as while the first example still carried a 37mm Puteaux gun as used on the regular FT-17s, the subsequent models used a 37mm Hotchkiss gun taken from the 5-barreled naval gun variant, though as you can imagine only one of the barrels is actually used on the tank. And this is capable of firing HE shells at a velocity of 442 meters a second, which does somewhat make it harder to aim effectively at longer ranges, and being only a HE shell does limit its anti-tank effectiveness. A 7.7mm Hotchkiss machine gun could also be mounted on the right side of the tank turret, which does give a little bit of extra firepower, while the armour remains broadly the same at a maximum of 22mm, and it is still manned by 2 crew members. Ultimately, only 15 of these Russian Renaults would be produced, with them being far too late to see combat during the Russian Civil War, but they would give valuable experience in designing, producing and operating tanks, with these now experienced Soviet engineers and designers able to move on to designing the next tank, the T-16, and ultimately laying the foundations for the Soviet Union to become a major tank developer in its own right. As for where they could go in War Thunder, the Russian Renaults could be added at 0.0 to 0.3, with this depending on the effectiveness of the 37mm guns' HE shells, as their ability to defeat tanks will likely be limited by the lack of an effective AP shell, though the side-mounted machine gun does offset this weakness a little bit, as does the effective armour and decent speed, though the 2-man crew does also represent a bit of a weakness in-game. While the original French variants could go at 0.0 for the machine gun variants and 0.3 for the 37mm gun variants. So that's it for this episode looking at Russian tanks of World War I that I would like to see added to War Thunder. I'd also be interested to hear your views on these vehicles, as well as any other vehicles you would like me to cover. I look forward to reading your comments below. So like I say, that's it for this episode. I'll be covering the Italians in the next episode, although I have covered them in previous videos, but not all together in one place, so like I say, I will cover them again in the next video, so hopefully you'll be looking forward to that. Anyway, hopefully you enjoyed the video. I've been Tyranno, and I'll see you next time.